So, hello and a very warm welcome back to the garden. I'm quite happy because we've had some rain, which means we're getting a little bit of success. Now, this video here is all about pest control and disease control using natural methods at work. This here is a brassica, it's a cauliflower. And I know most people net their brassicas because of things like cabbage white butterflies. I refuse to do that. And so we're going to be looking into all sorts of things to help make your garden more resilient to pests and diseases. And this is a collaboration video for Dŵr Cymru Welsh Water's Pest Smart campaign, encouraging smarter ways of dealing with weeds, pests and diseases in the garden, moving away from pesticides so we can look after people, water and wildlife. This video is going to be a lot of tips, but the main thing is different principles that make the biggest difference, because the first thing we've got to understand is, why do pests and diseases exist in nature? Well, usually it's because there's a weaker plant or there's a dying plant, and it's just a way to speed up its death so you can get all of those minerals to be water soluble, to be enjoyed and utilized by other plants. So you need pests and diseases in a natural ecosystem to help with that. Now, the issue with gardens is that we're trying to grow food and we're up against nature, and it's very easy to fall into a trap of always trying to work against nature. Part of that is things like monoculture and just growing loads of things in one place. And that isn't what nature is. In nature, in a thriving ecosystem, you never see really, except for a few extreme cases, a certain disease just obliterate a whole area of land. Maybe it'll affect one kind of crop, but it doesn't affect the whole entire ecosystem. Things can still live, things can still adapt, and it's a similar principle in the garden. The most important thing to get from this video is that diversity, plant diversity and polyculture is the single best way, I feel, to reduce pest and disease issues. It's one of the reasons why I don't bother netting brassicas, and it's one of the reasons why I encourage lots of flowers in and around the kitchen garden. So let's start off with cabbage white butterfly. So the butterflies themselves aren't actually a pest. You could consider them as a beneficial insect because they go around and pollinate flowers. The pest, though, is their caterpillars. And they love things like, this is a spring cabbage that is headed up really nicely, that we're going to harvest today. And when it's very easy to just look away for a couple of weeks and then lose a bunch of brassicas to cabbage white caterpillars. Now, the easiest way of dealing with them, I wouldn't say it's the best, but the easiest is by netting them. The number one thing is you don't want the leaves touching the netting, because this is still a perfectly valid site for a butterfly to come along and lay the eggs through the leaves. And you've kind of got this kind of thing going on psychologically where if you think something's under netting, you think it's protected. And so you just don't look at it because you just assume it's protected. But there's been so many cases that I've heard where people have thought, the kale is fine, leave it for a month, and then realise there's virtually no kale left whatsoever. So sometimes the act of not netting something means that you have to be, or you can be, a little bit more observant, so you can take action if you see caterpillars. So really it's about finding a balance and what works for you. It's easy to see lots of different methods online with how to deal with pests and diseases. There's going to be people that swear by a certain technique, and on the same comment thread you've got other gardeners saying, no, this doesn't work. And what I want to encourage you to do is to be curious, to be quite experimental, and just see how it works in your garden. Take all of these different methods and test it out. And so what that's going to do is that over the years you're going to build up an arsenal of techniques of knowing what works for your garden and what doesn't work. And I think it's really important to remember, with gardening there's so many ways of achieving the same result. Like there's 50 ways of growing a potato. There's so many ways of, say, dealing with slugs or preventing slugs. And so just be experimental and see what happens. I think that is going to make the biggest difference. One of the biggest challenges in a garden, especially with young spring growth, is dealing with aphids. You can get them, say, on tomatoes, you can get them on brassicas, all sorts of different crops. Now, the best thing to do is to create an environment that's going to bring ladybird larvae, because the larvae eat so many more aphids than ladybirds themselves. And One thing, this is a tip that I did in one video that ended up getting me banned on the No Dig Facebook group, which is simply showing how you make, using a completely natural liquid soap, you make a soapy spray that coats the aphids and it just stops them from working, and that caused a big fuss, but it works really well. I think it's very easy to get caught up on all sorts of little things. It's not going to create any impact on bigger insects, for example ladybirds or pollinators, and at the end of the day most of us, we're just trying to grow food to feed our families. We're having a net positive impact on the environment. The fact that apparently putting a little bit of soapy spray is going to cause environmental carnage and destruction, I'm not going to believe that for a second. Don't believe it for a second. Look at all of the life that a garden like this creates. So I want to introduce to you the most fantastic natural form of pesticide that any organic garden could possibly go for, and that is insect life. You want to get as much insect life into your garden as possible. It's very easy to just talk about beneficial insects and just think bees, but you've also got many other different things like ladybirds, but also hoverflies and lacewings, whose larvae really go for aphids and all sorts of other things. Then you've got parasitic wasps. Parasitic wasps are another massive plethora of insects that target all sorts of different things, be it cabbage white butterflies or aphids. And so the way to do that, the best way to encourage this natural pesticide into your garden, which is all of these insects, is super cheap, because it's only going to cost you a few seeds for the most part. So an example, just looking around here, these are some leeks that I've let flower, absolutely adored by pollinators and also hoverflies. I'm letting some of my plants here, like this broccoli, just a little bit run to flower, letting a bit of coriander. Now, I've got other things growing around the garden, like lots of dill, which is just self-sown, and dill flowers really attract a lot of hoverflies especially. And so that cost me absolutely nothing, letting it self-seed, just like calendula, just like all of the borage around here, all self-seeded, all of the nasturtiums, all of these flowers that bring in all of those beneficial insects. And so the only sacrifice you have in order to create a really productive, abundant, and pretty pest-free environment is a little bit of space for some flowers, where 90% of which are edible, and the aesthetic value to the garden is, there's no comparison. What you do by building a strong insect life is that you start to bring in other things, for example smaller mammals and birds, and then you're kind of treating your garden as its own ecosystem with all of the different natural animal kingdom hierarchies, with us being at the top enjoying all of the foods but sharing a little bit as well. And so birds, a lot of them can target your bigger things such as caterpillars and such as slugs. Of course birds do like things like strawberries, you can't blame them, can you? So things like berries we usually end up netting. That's about the only thing that I do physically protect from pests here in the garden, is any of the red berries I do protect by netting. If you are netting against birds, you absolutely have to make sure that you check that netting at least once a day, because sometimes birds can just find their way in and get a little stuck, so you might need to help them out. And so if you're going away for the weekend, it's sometimes a good idea to take off that netting or get a neighbour just to check, because the last thing you want to do is catch a bird in the netting. If you want a good starting point for a load of different natural pest control tips to try out in your garden, then head over to www.pestsmart.wales or .cymru for Welsh. One of the important questions is, it's all well and nice in a permaculture kitchen garden talking about integrating some flowers here and there and not planting too many crops so it doesn't all get taken over if a disease or pest comes along. But what about translating this to a larger scale? Can it be done? Of course it can be done. You just change the way that you adapt it. So instead of making it fairly intricate and complicated like this, instead you still grow in blocks, but you can either interplant or then divide rows of crops up with beneficial insect attracting crops, or you can cap the ends of rows. There's so many different ways that these principles can be translated. It doesn't just exist here in the garden, it can definitely exist on a farm scale as well. There's so many amazing no-dig market gardens out there using similar methods, so I'll link to a couple for you to check out down below in the video description. If you want to see some absolutely amazing kitchen gardens and permaculture gardens that are using very natural pest control methods that are absolutely thriving, full of food, nice and abundant, watch this playlist here. It's the Inspiring Gardens playlist, and I hope it gives you a lot of confidence that you too can enjoy a nice, pretty pest-free garden.